Hi, everybody. January 20th, 2020. So maybe this is an omen of some kind. First guest of the new year is Lee Jussim, who is a professor of psychology at Rutgers University. Lee and I got to know each other over Twitter. This is the first time that we're meeting in person. I look forward to hopefully meeting you soon in person. Lee,
Same
thank you
here.
so much for coming on the show. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
So I thought maybe we'd start. I think you got your PhD around 87. Does that sound right?
Yeah,
Uh,
87.
and University of Michigan, which is one of the
Yeah.
top psychology departments in the world. As a matter of fact, my doctoral supervisor at Cornell got his PhD in psychology at the University of Michigan at the same time as Tversky and Kahneman when they were there. Uh,
Really?
yeah. So he comes from a really
Who's your advisor?
Jay Russo.
I don't know.
Yeah, he's a behavioral decision theory guy. So he is part of the tradition of Kahneman, Tversky,
Yeah,
Thaler,
yeah,
who recently
yeah.
won the Nobel Prize. Thaler was also my professor at Cornell. So I come
Mm,
very much from that tradition, and then I pivoted to more evolutionary psychology. So
yeah.
why don't we start with some of the original work that got you into hot trouble because you were trying to attack some sacred cows?
Yeah. So when I was a graduate student in social psychology at Michigan, I just wanted to be a good social psychologist. Like, I loved social psychology. I love the idea of being able to study kind of what makes normal people tick. And when I say normal, I mean I wasn't interested in psychotherapy or psychopathology, just like, well, what is normal? That's a whole other issue. But
Sure.
people without the day-to-day functioning that didn't inherently involve psychopathology. That's
Right.
what how I'm using the word normal. So this was like an amazing prospect to me, and I just wanted to be good at it. So, and I bought, when you get trained in social psychology in graduate school, at least especially in the 80s, I think it's still mostly true. You learn about this slew. I mean, you're talking about having been trained by somebody sort of comfortable with, sort of in the same sort of intellectual milieu as Kahneman and Tversky. This, especially in the 80s, it was all error and bias.
Right.
And it was cognitive error and bias, but it was also probably the 70s and 80s was really the beginning of a sort of tidal wave of research on stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination. And social psychology had always addressed those topics, but it was like one among lots of other things that social psychology had done, really the 70s and 80s that became this like huge thing. And again, I was a graduate student. I mostly believed what I was told. I mean, I was trying to be critical and analytical and all that sort of stuff. But okay, so there were really two main areas of research for me when I was a graduate student. One was on teacher expectations and self-fulfilling prophecies. So I knew about the Rosenthal and Jacobson study, where you randomly assign students to teachers such that the teachers are misled to believing that some are really smart and some aren't. And by the end of the year, what they find is that the kids they believed who were smart, but were really just randomly selected, actually did better on IQ tests. I
Right.
mean, not just like grades, on IQ. So that's like an amazing finding. And I wanted to better understand it. So the trick there, I thought, was that, they misled teachers. So that's wasn't wrong, for the experimental purpose of trying to see how erroneous expectations might be self-fulfilling. That's completely fair. It's completely fine. But it doesn't really tell you what teachers do undisturbed. So that was really my dissertation work, was looking at sort of naturally occurring teacher expectations and, the extent to which they, it's correlational data. So, the whole causality thing is much more difficult. But we had longitudinal data, we had a ton of data, we had lots of control variables. And so to the best of our ability, we were trying to estimate the extent to which teacher expectations. And the narrow thing would be predicted changes in student achievement by the end of the year, which we saw as consistent with the occurrence of self-fulfilling prophecy, although because it was correlational data, you can never completely rule anything out. Okay. So that was what we did. And I found two things. I found self-fulfilling prophecy effect. I mean, teacher expectations early in the year, even when you control for prior achievement, you control for motivation, you control for smooth demographics, even with all that, they still predicted changes in student achievement. So,
sorry, what is the mechanism by which the self-fulfilling prophecy manifests itself? Is it that you call out more on them, you pay more attention to them? Is that the mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do work. My own work was not on the process, but other people have. And yeah, I mean, that's, one way or another, teachers favor the kids that they have higher expectations for. And that manifests in lots of ways. Sometimes they're just nicer to them. Sometimes they give them harder assignments. Sometimes it's like the combination. In fact, and this makes common sense, actually, right? If you want to uplift somebody's achievement, you probably should do two things. You should hold them to a high standard, but provide them kind of the wherewithal and support needed to meet that standard. And kind of intuitively, it seemed like teachers were doing this more for the high expectancy kids than the low expectancy. So that was probably the main. So, but the effects I was getting were small. They were like standardized regression coefficients, kind of like correlation coefficients. I mean, I know you know this, but if this
sure.
So about 0.1 to 0.2, which are small. They're not tiny. The last 15 years, 20 years of social psychology has revealed that effects of 0.1 to 0.2, which might be considered small in some absolute sense, are actually not that atypical for social psychology. We're a field that it turns out are dealing with, much of the field is dealing with non-existent effects, and the rest that is dealing with existent effects is dealing with very small effects. So
and if they're existing effects, they're non-replicable.
Well, but I would include those as non-existent effects.
Fair enough.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, I was getting these small effects, and given the narrative discourse about the power and pervasiveness of self-fulfilling prophecies and their roles in creating some societal inequalities, an intellectual line which has modern reverberations. I won't go down that tangent at the moment. It was like, what the hell? So that was number one. Number two, because I was doing it in naturally occurring expectations rather than experimentally manipulated ones, we could look at accuracy. So, accuracy, there's all this assessing anything in social science is often difficult. It's more difficult than it seems. But at its root, accuracy is really, and I said this because there's all this scholarship on accuracy and how it's so difficult and complex and and there's ways in which that's true. But conceptually, at its root, it's really simple. If I say it's going to rain tomorrow and it rains, then I'm right. If it doesn't rain, I'm wrong. It's the same thing with people. If I say you're going to be an A, you're going to get an A in your class, and I'm not your teacher, so I'm not interacting with you. No matter what the process is, you either get an A or you don't, and I'm either right or I'm wrong. It's really, really simple. Okay, so at least conceptually, it's very simple. So having real-world naturalistic data, what we could do and did was you simply compare the simple correlation of early in the year teacher expectations with end of the year student achievement. So you have some simple, no modeling, just a simple correlation. Then we have the regression coefficient. So if you do all the modeling stuff and to the best
we don't
of
need
our
to
ability,
worry about the trees.
the details.
Yeah,
right. That's right. That's right. I know, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if the overall correlation is 0.5 and the effect is 0.1, 0.4 is accuracy. Right. It's saying teacher expectations are predicting student achievement probably about 80%, 0.4 out of 0.5, because they're simply right than because of self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. This was just not in the discourse. The idea, first was accuracy in social psychology at that time in the 80s, had been stigmatized as an area of topic. of study for like 30 years. It was beginning to come back. A couple of people had papers that tried to bring it back more or less successfully eventually. But at the time, it was like a forbidden topic. So you got these two things so far. You have small self-fulfilling prophecy effects, large accuracy in teacher expectations, neither of which was in the discourse. Okay, so as a brief tangent, I went back, I started with, well, why is my work so different than everybody else's? So I went back to by that time, by the 80s, there was a ton of work on teacher expectations. So I said, okay, I started with the assumption that there was something different about this is basic graduate student 101. You have two studies, they produce a different result. You want to figure out why. You look kind of for the methods or the statistics. That's all I did, right? What I discover, to me, it was jaw dropping. And as I'm retelling it, it's like my jaw dropping again. When I went back to the original studies, I didn't find anything very different than anybody else found. Everybody who's doing that found, on average, and way on average, either small or non-existent self-fulfilling prophecy effects in the classroom. So even the original Rosenthal and Jacobson study, the study that started it all, the overall correlation, the overall effect size of teacher expectations predicting or causing student achievement was about 0.15. This was almost exactly what I had. It was like my same result. It wasn't discussed that way. It was discussed as this amazing, powerful thing, so that's Rosenthal and Jacobson. And then there were all these meta-analyses, these quantitative studies of like, what's the overall effect for scores or sometimes hundreds of studies. And those typically found that almost 2/3 of the studies didn't even get the effect at all. But that means about a third did. So if the studies were done exquisitely well, okay, so that's a gigantic if, but let's stipulate that these studies are done.
Let's try to finish this story because I want to cover a lot more stuff. So forgive me for being an impolite guest.
No, it's like fine. This is the thing, right? But it hinges on this stuff, right? Yeah. So if the studies are done well and there was no effect there, only 5% of them should produce an effect.
Right.
That a third were producing an effect means there was something there. That 2/3 weren't means it was pretty small. So going into this literature that served as the basis for these soaring narratives about the power of self-fulfilling prophecies never, ever found stuff consistent with that. Okay, that was number one.
Congratulations. This is officially, after 5 years of doing the SAAD Truth, the longest answer, almost 13 minutes. So I will tell my wife that we won't be able to make it to our summer vacation because I'll be chatting with Lee Jussim for the next 18 years.
These things are complicated. I wish I had sound bites.
There's this little thing called synthesisly. You might want to look into that. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So, but so we want to have an organic conversation, right? So back and forth. So, so what jarred people, I think, I'm not very familiar with your work, is that there was a racial component to some of your research where some of the sort of the required narrative you didn't find, right? That the white teacher would be more discriminating in terms of who they call out. And so in a sense, starting from that work, you were knee deep into identity politics before you even knew that it might have been called that, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And actually the second vein of my research, more than the teacher expectation stuff, that brought me into this weird sort of contrarian dissident place was work on the accuracy and inaccuracy of stereotypes.
Right.
And it was a very similar story. So I bought, the line in social psychology all emphasized the inaccuracy of stereotypes. So this would be the 1980s. And, I started doing work on person perception. Do stereotypes bias? If you know that a person is male or female or black or white or rich or poor, does that influence or bias or distort how you judge that person? That's really what I was doing. And there was all the scholarship declaring stereotypes to be inaccurate. So I just wanted to understand the literature.
But let me ask you, before you go on, as someone who hasn't studied academically stereotypes, let me just kind of weigh in with two possibilities, one sinister, one not. The sinister view of stereotypes would be you're trying to use a blanket statement to tar a people. Jews are shifty, right? The non-sinister, and to use the language of an evolutionary psychologist, sort of the adaptive perspective,
right,
would be we've evolved brains to be able to detect statistical regularities, and therefore those statistical regularities become encapsulated in a stereotype, which more often than not is perfectly accurate. Does that seem to make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I don't do, so this is our you're in my gap. I don't do evolutionary psychology. I'm fine with people doing it, but it's just not my expertise, so I can't easily make those arguments.
But why, by the way? Just is it because you never found it useful to what you're studying, or if you were to, immerse yourself, do you think that there might be some insights that might be able to complement your work if it came from an evolutionary lens?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, almost every time I have any discussion about accuracy with somebody, with people who are evolutionary psychologists, they are always saying almost exactly what you're just saying. Yeah. It's completely compatible with an evolutionary. But there's only so much you can do, right? So I just never got the expertise. So I'm reluctant to make proclamations about, or even do much serious analysis about how it fits with evolutionary psychology perspectives. It would be a reach for me.
But are people in your department the traditionally hostile folks to EP, meaning evolutionary psychology, or do you feel that over the past 20 years there's been some inroad and some acceptance of the value of an evolutionary lens to the study of human behavior?
It's like both.
Okay.
Yeah, it's both. So my department has four main areas: clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and social.
So let me rank them in terms of acceptance or non-acceptance. Social psychology, if you're an evolutionist, you're a Nazi, you're Himmler. Cognitive, somewhat. Neuroscience is fine. Clinical, never heard of Darwin. Right?
Yeah, that's pretty close. What I would say is our cognitive group is more sympathetic to evolutionary ideas than maybe most, and then that. And even the social group has become less hostile over the last 20 years. That's why it was a bit of both. I think there was some time about 10, 15 years ago, we were hiring a social psychologist, and one of the senior social psychologists faculty said, I'm never going to hire an evolutionary psychologist.
It's unbelievable.
So it was blunt. But that was 15 years ago. The way you framed it has that changed somewhat in the last 20 years? And I think it has. There is openness to evolution. There's still some resistance and queasiness, but it's not that visceral hostility that you sometimes see, even among people who started that way.
Actually, by the way, since you're from the University of Michigan, I have a wonderful personal, well, not wonderful, but an anecdote from the University of Michigan. When my first book was published, I was invited by both the psychology department at University of Michigan and the next day by the business school, the Ross School of Business, to give a talk on, how to Darwinize evolution, consumer psychology. And so I gave the exact same talk back-to-back days. When I gave the talk in the psychology department, it was very, very well received. Yeah, this is gorgeous stuff. I give the exact same talk in the business school. I couldn't finish a single sentence without having the metaphorical tomatoes thrown at me. So
in the business school, I'm surprised.
Yeah, right. I think the first question, if I remember correctly, that was asked to me was a good, harbinger of what was to come. A person put up their hand and said, Professor SAAD, are you saying that consumers are animals? With like disdain. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So there was this, what I call, actually, it's not me. This is not my term. It's a beautiful term, though. There's something called the human reticence effect, which basically goes something like this. And in a sense, it's a bias. It's perfectly fine to use evolutionary thinking to explain the behavior of every single animal except the human animal.
Right. yeah. No, I mean, I've seen that. There's a recent paper, I don't know if you saw it, by Buss and von Hippel on sort of the ideological, but
Yeah.
it sort of captures that inherently.
Exactly. I mean, the beauty, I think, one of the beauties of the beautiful things about the science enterprise is that it is autocorrective. And so the idea is that.
So you say.
Well,
go ahead.
Okay, so you're not as optimistic as I am. You think that there are dogmatic obstacles that one can't penetrate?
Kant is a really strong statement. I don't know if I'm quite that pessimistic, but it's really, really difficult. And far more often, in my opinion, far more often than many people suspect, we engage in self-correction, scientific self-correction, painfully slowly, so slow that it is often hard to detect that we're doing it at all.
Right. Now, in evolutionary psychology, as you said about the Buss et al. Paper, and I've certainly written a lot about it, there are clear cognitive and emotional reasons why people might hold a bias against evolutionary theory. But more generally, why do you think it is so difficult for the average person, let alone the scientist who is tasked with pursuing the truth in an unbiased manner? Why is it so difficult for us, once we are anchored in a position, to change our opinions, irrespective of the tsunami of evidence that I might show you that is contrary to your position? Why is that an indelible part of the human condition?
So, first place, I'm not so sure that it is, there are definite obstacles to doing that. But I'm not so sure that on an individual basis. So the worst obstacles are what are colloquially called echo chambers.
Right.
Right. So but that's a different mechanism. So if you live in an echo chamber and everybody thinks alike, and evolutionary psychology is the province of sexists and racists, and what you're doing is phrenology, then and everyone around you thinks this. Like, why would you not think that? Right. And if you see an article or hear someone make another point, you have this network of opposing beliefs and values that that is ready to reject this. You have talking points, you have rhetoric, you have maybe some reasonable criticisms and stuff. So it's very easy when exposed in a short-term, one-off or couple-off ways to reject something. So I see that. So there's that. Certainly for deeply held beliefs and values, our ability to engage in biased reasoning and confirmation bias is off the charts. So those are the main obstacles. But I also think that absent the social network, people are actually more open to information than psychology gives them credit for. So if you're not a dogmatic ideologue, and which includes but is not restricted to politics, and if you're not enmeshed in a web of groupthink, people change their views, actually. Right. They're open to alternative views.
But, I mean, what's interesting about academia is you would think that there'd be a self-selection bias. You're already laughing before I ask the question. There should be a self-selection bias for open-mindedness, for not being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, but to question everything. And yet these people who are tasked with pushing the envelope of human knowledge are some of the ones who are most dogmatic in the erection of echo chambers. Why that reality?
Well, so, that's a big question. First place, I think the assumption there is correct. I think that is absolutely true. I think academia has become an echo chamber. Maybe it always was. I mean, I wasn't around in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
So I don't really know. But it seems like it's gotten worse. And I think if I had to guess why it's gotten worse, I would say that's because of the informal yet very real slow-moving purge of really anyone to the right of, sort of hardcore progressive value. And so academia is filled with people in general. I mean, smart people sometimes say stupid things, but in general, they're smart. Even the people who I viscerally disagree with, they're not like stupid. So.
Except they are. And let me tell you why. So in my forthcoming book, where I talk about idea pathogens and how these idea pathogens parasitize human minds, the ecosystem from which these idea pathogens all started is from academia. In other words, it takes academics to come up with some of the dumbest and most laughable and anti-common sense, right? I mean, so yes, academics are some of the smartest people, but they're also some of the most anti-reason, anti-logic, anti-science people. And that's the beautiful dichotomy of this whole thing, right?
I think that's right. I was going to say it's the worst in the non-scientific fields, the humanities and some of the softer social sciences, because they're not hinged by the scientific constraints. Like even heavily biased scientists have to at least attempt or pretend for their claims to fit scientific standards. So you need empirical evidence, you need statistics usually, and it turns out to be easier for scientists to make even the evidence and statistics dance the dance they wanted to dance than we once thought. But there's some constraint there as opposed to no constraint.
Right.
And in the humanities and the softer social sciences, it's just narrative.
Right.
It's just narrative. So there's no constraint.
It's my truth, right?
That's right.
There is no capital T. But incidentally, and I'm sure you know this, but maybe some of our viewers may not know this, the attacks on the scientific method are now coming hard and fast, even within the natural sciences. So the idea, for example, the very postmodernist idea that there are many ways of knowing, of which the scientific method is only one, right? So there is a physicist at the University of New Hampshire, a physicist who basically argues that physics is a white, patriarchal.
What's it? Prescott Weinstein.
Very good. Yeah. Look at you. Look at you. So she's not an outlier. Obviously, she's in the minority, but right. It doesn't take. You don't need to have a majority of intellectual terrorists to scare the rest of us into jumping off the abyss, right? So how do we turn this around? I know, look, you've got the Heterodox Academy and you guys are doing fantastic stuff. You could talk about that if you'd like. That's wonderful. But are we going to be able to reverse the ship, or are we doomed?
Well, that is the $1,000,000 question. And I wish I could give like kind of a clear answer, and I can't. So like one clear answer is no. I mean, it's like beyond repair, and we're actually doomed. And what it's just the trajectory is all down. It has done nothing but gotten worse for the last 20 years or more, and I see no reason for it to ever improve at all. So that would be a coherent answer, and that kind of it might even be true. But I don't really know that because in addition to, that part is true. I think that description is fairly valid. But at the same time, there are some efforts to push back on this. As you were saying, there's Heterodox Academy. Just this past weekend, I came from a Heterodox Psychology Conference, which is not affiliated with
Is that the conference where I should have been the plenary speaker, but somehow I was forgotten to be invited? Is that the one? Okay, got it.
Yeah, that's the one. That's absolutely the one. Yeah. And you would be great there, actually. And it was a really good conference, and I'm really glad I went. So that, Heterodox Academy, its efforts so far have been worthwhile, but kind of soft. And when I say soft, they're in a very difficult position because they want traction in academia, and I think they realize, the leadership realizes that if they push back too hard on some of the worst, what I would call nutcase ideas in academia, they're going to risk losing some of their potential supporters, right? So they want to be big and have a milder argument reach the academic masses. At the Heterodox Psychology Conference, it was all about the data. And, these were like scientists whose demeanor was like, I really don't care if I piss you off. Here's the goddamn data. Good. You want to show me I'm wrong? That's the go ahead. You're welcome to try to do that. But here's the goddamn data. So I prefer that. It's like, I got into this to be a scientist. I really don't care about people's sensibilities. Right. I mean, I care a little bit, but look, I'm chair of my department. In some sense, I have to care about people's sensibilities. Right. Can't run a department if you do that. But scientifically, I really, you want to be thoughtful. There are scientific issues of not wanting to go over the top and make overstatements and create your own overly dramatic counter narratives. That's a bona fide scientific issue. But assuming I make a reasonably good effort to do that, and it upsets someone, I kind of couldn't care less.
Right.
So,
but I think, I'm glad you're saying this because anyone who has met me knows, if I can speak of myself, I'm a very warm person. I'm a very jovial guy. But also, for those of you who follow me, they know that I can also roll up the sleeves and be a brawler. It really is part of the panoply of what makes who I am. I truly believe that when you are fighting for truth, and you're fighting against, and here I'll use some powerful language, intellectual terrorists, it's okay to be tough. It's okay to be morally indignant, because when you are parasitizing the minds of generations of students whose parents are going into debt so that they could fund their bullshit feminist glaciology degree and feminist chemistry degree, then if you're not indignant, then your diplomacy is part of you being complicit in the spread of bullshit. So yes, when I meet you, when you come, as I've had guests on my show who were previous Islamic terrorists, I'm very polite with them because they're my guests. I'm always jovial. But when you engage me on Twitter, for example, and you act like a moron, I can come back at you very hard. Now, this doesn't say anything about who I am, right? This is the fundamental attribution error. People think, oh, well, Dr. Saad, you have two different personas. I don't have two different personas. How I act when someone attacks me in an alley is different than how I act when I tuck my children to bed. Fundamental attribution error. So I think more scientists have to actually be more indignant. We're tired of the BS. Stop being so diplomatic and gentle. You cannot espouse anti-science positions and expect decent people to accept it. So get angry.
Well, I agree with that. I'm sympathetic.
But how can we get our colleagues to agree with that? Some of them who are very sophisticated thinkers, but who are too sweet and nice.
Right. So one, again, I don't claim to have any answers, but it's more like I am totally on board and have begun to make some efforts towards building a toolbox of methods to do that. So that's, that is absolutely the question. It's a very difficult question.
Right. To do that, meaning what? To engage the lunacy? What is that?
Yeah, to engage and refute the lunacy and garner recognition of how lunatic some of the stuff is.
Right.
So some of that is conventional scientific practices, papers and reviews and empirical data showing this is what they claimed and there's no evidence to support that. But that lots of people have been doing that for a long time and are mostly losing the battle. So that's not sufficient. That might be useful. It's a tool, but by itself, it's not enough. Okay. And that's including. Well, so let me give you an example of what has proven effective as a model in a related but slightly different area, but which has proven effective as a model for how to do this. So as you know, and probably most of your viewers at this point, within the last 10 years, psychology has undergone what sometimes is called the replication crisis. All these famous studies that other people can't replicate. I would say that produced a burgeoning movement to reform scientific practices in psychology. That has had some traction. It has improved practices. Right. We're not where we should be, but they're way better than they were 10 years ago, in my opinion. And so what they did that's a little bit different than what you and I are now talking about, which is sort of ideologically nutcase ideas that seem to be emerging. But what they did was they organized. And they organized in ways reminiscent of political movements.
Right.
So that...
By organized, you mean, for example, I think the Reproducibility Project and so on, right? Is that what
you have the Reproducibility Project. There is probably the vanguard is the Society for the Improvement of Psych Science.
Right.
And, they have meetings every year, and then they have satellite meetings at the major conferences, and there are now several hundred people involved in this. It might be higher. It might be close to 1,000. There are several hundred people at the conference, and then there are other sort of sympathetic people who maybe don't attend the conference. No, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of psychologists. So that's why I would characterize them as a vanguard, and they're still a minority, I think. But they have made certain improved practices normal. Right. So it's common now for graduate students and professors, especially early career professors, but even senior people like you and me, to pre-register studies.
Right.
To write up a document saying this is what we predict, this is how we're going to do it, and then when you publish it, there's still issues. There's often slippage. I don't know often. Sometimes there's slippage between the pre-registration and what makes it into the paper. So there's issues there. But having pre-registration as opposed to not having it is an improvement.
Right. Of course.
Right. Okay. So that said, that movement has pretty largely not embraced dealing with the sort of political or ideological sort of groupthink like dogmatic problems. It hasn't embraced sort of political bias as a threat to the validity of psychological or other social sciences.
Yeah, they're restricting their focus to the epistemological value of replication, and it ends there.
Yeah. Well, it's more than the statistics,
sure,
methods more broadly, but yes, that's right. So they're not the solution to the kinds of problems you and I are talking about. Maybe some, to the extent that the methods constrain the conclusions, it might help somewhat, but they're not directly taking it on.
Right.
But they may be modeling unintentionally one of the tools for how to take it on, which is to get organized.
Right.
So that's why I like the Heterodox Psych Conference. I hope Heterodox Academy becomes more active doing things like this. But whether or not that happens, I think that is a tool.
Now
see it this way, should get organized.
You just a few days ago put up a semi-satirical article on Psychology Today. Both you and I are columnists there, where you basically, rather than me explain it, why don't you explain it and tell us the story?
Yeah. So I call it the Orwell lexicon.
I like it a lot.
Yeah. So this, and it is a manifestation of another tool in this toolbox that in addition to being sort of outraged and angry and saying and showing why no, that's wrong, that's ridiculous, and here's why it's ridiculous, and and you can write a review paper on why, as you said before, I have this paper on scientific gullibility. Why the hell are people believing this stuff? You can kind of really go through it. That's in there. That's a piece. But another tool, and I've only recently come around to this, and this is new, and I'm still working on learning how to do this, but the Orwell lexicon is the first piece of that, is to come up with an entirely new way of a new rhetoric that directly rejects this sort of rising tide of ridiculousness, in part by turning their own rhetorical flourishes on them.
Yeah. It's also called the GAD-SAAD has been doing this for 20 plus years strategy. You might want to look into that.
Actually, if you have, whether it's blogs or papers written up on how to do that, listen, I am open for business. We need all the help we can get.
I'll tell you, let me tell you, yes, I'd be happy to follow up on your request, but generally speaking, one of the tools that I use, and for obviously my viewers would know this, and I think since you follow me on social media, you probably know this. I use satire, sarcasm, and humor as one of the many tools to mock the idiocy, right? Now, most people fully understand this, and I suspect that I have a large following in part because I do use a multiplicity of strategies, right? I'm not just the sober academic who talks about the stats of meta-analyses. Now, that's fine and that's important, but you also have to have a whole arsenal of weaponry to shoot down the BS. And so the reason why I use satire, and in my forthcoming book, I have a section where I talk about the power of satire, and the term that I use is I say, when properly used, satire is like the surgeon's scalpel cutting through, layers of bullshit, right? I mean, I could give you
yes, that's right, absolutely.
Stats and p-values and ANCOVA and MANOVA, or right. I could just mock you into oblivion. And so when I saw your right, I usurp, for example, the language that they use. I reversed it. So, for example, the identity. So I call myself the king of the oppression Olympics, right? I'm a Lebanese Jew from the Middle East who's a war refugee. So as soon as someone attacks me using identity politics, if I know that they are, say, white, then right. I will take on the persona of someone who is aggrieved using the, and so I become untouchable. Right? But again, most academics are not comfortable doing this. They don't know how to do this. I mean, is there a seminar we could teach them? Or is that...
No, so you're saying that, and it sounded like a half joke, but actually, if we're serious, and I think we are, about combating this stuff, actually at conferences, whether it's a Heterodox Academy conference or Heterodox Psychology conference or some smaller thing, doing presentations on, sort of how to productively mock ridiculous ideas, I'll sign up. We should do a panel on it. I would totally do that right now. So, I use, in the Orwell lexicon, I use this mixture of sort of psychologies and sort of intersectional postmodernism.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
To come up with these terms that are designed that in my fantasy, people would take screenshots and would, when they're being attacked the way you just described, just take screenshots of the term and not actually say anything about the person, because the example would be, you're doing this right now. Right. So I did this earlier today. One of the people I follow tweeted an article about, I think some news reporter, maybe in Denver, was fired for saying there are only two sexes. Yeah, right? So, but one of the terms in the Orwell lexicon is binary phobia.
Love it.
Which is the fear that some things really are binary.
And I gave you the opposite mechanism. I know. That's what you and I were.
So yes, that inspired the
epistemological dichotomania.
Yeah, right. That was great. That was absolutely great.
But tell me, because not that I want to shame them, because they've been a wonderful host for my column, but let's shame them. Psychology Today decided you posted the lexicon on your blog
Yeah.
there, they took it down.
They took it down.
And
Yes.
where are we in that process? You appealed it, and what
I
happened?
did. So I put in an appeal late Friday, so they haven't gotten back yet.
Okay.
They claimed, not completely without justification, that the piece was mostly advocacy and opinion rather than, like a summary of scientific or scholarly based stuff.
Right. But when somebody on Psychology Today diagnoses from distance that Trump suffers from all sorts of mental disorders, that's
Absolutely.
not advocacy. That's serious
right.
science. Got it.
That was part of my appeal, actually.
Oh, good for you. Okay.
Yeah. And actually, a number, not all, but many of the concepts in the Orwell lexicon are actually grounded in actual scholarship. So here's another one, the bias. It's a bias for seeing biases, often manifesting as either claiming bias where none exists, exaggerating biases that do exist, or overgeneralizing to large swaths of life from studies finding bias in some narrow or specific context. Now, Gerd Gigerenzer, this guy spent his whole life pushing back on Kahneman and Tversky's bias stuff, has a paper called The Bias. So this is, it kind of sounds funny, and it's, kind of mocking and critical, but it's not like it's unhinged. There's actually, there are a bunch of the examples have that, actually.
So where are you now? So you didn't publish it there. Is it up somewhere? Because then maybe I could post it in the description section to our chat.
So it's in, it's in the appeal. They're probably I'm guessing they're going to reject the appeal, like today. I do have, I kept working on it after they took it down. So it's somewhat expanded.
How many entries do you have right now?
I don't know, but
roughly 100, 500.
I'm looking at it now. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4.5 pages. Okay. Each one. So I don't know. It's probably not quite 100.
Right. Wow.
Probably on the double digit side of over 50. It goes from A to W. So,
how many of the entries were proposed by fellow academics?
I don't have a count, but this started as just like a ridiculous thing on Twitter, right? It was like, and I didn't really have any plan to write it up. It was like I was reacting as sort of consistent with this conversation to just this endless ridiculousness on Twitter. And one of my regular followers, we're mutual followers. This guy's an engineer, but he's really smart, really thoughtful, pretty politically conservative. And so, but somehow interested in academia. So, of course, he has a very different take on academia. And he was the one in some other conversation, unrelated to this, who said, you're not going to convince any of these people. What you need is an alternative vision of how the world works. And so that's what inspired. It was that. It's like, you know what? I should take this seriously and write it up. So probably about 20, 30%, maybe even more, are maybe 10 to 15% are intact versions of things people propose on Twitter. And they know I'm using it. I let them know. And sometimes I give them credit. Sometimes they don't want it. They want to stay anonymous. Yeah. And then another 10 or 20% are like me modifying, sort of bouncing off. They maybe their idea was good, but the word was awkward, or maybe the word was good, but the idea wasn't expressed well. So they're definitely inspired by things other people said. But here is one that I've used intact that was entirely from a non-academic supporter, and that's several people have already said this is their favorite. Chapeau rouge-ophobia. Fear and loathing of Trump supporters. It's just a thing of simple beauty.
So it's Trump derangement syndrome, but using a sartorial cue.
Absolutely. So Trump's derangement syndrome is sort of an interesting thing, right? But so I have it separated into sort of being obsessed with Trump versus these sort of attitudes towards his supporters, both of which are probably different manifestations of Trump derangement syndrome. Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder, as a psychologist, I wonder what you think of this idea. So, for example, I'm someone who, if I feel that I know something, then I walk with all of the gravitas of someone, who's got a chip on their shoulder. I know this, and you better come to the fight ready. On the other hand, when I don't know something, I truly exhibit epistemic humility. So if an undergraduate student asks me a question that's got me stumped, I'll just say, that's a great question. I really don't know the answer to this. And as I explained in my forthcoming book, that really builds trust because they see that you're honest enough to say, I don't know. But when it comes to not the epistemic humility side, when I know something and I walk with the full gravitas, then I'm always willing to put myself out there because I always feel that my personhood is sufficiently confident that I completely don't care about the repercussions. I really do walk around with I don't give a fuck attitude, right? Not because I'm faking it. I'm not faking it. That's just who I am, right? Sometimes my wife tells me, "Could you just keep your big mouth shut a bit so that we can, so that you don't get punished in terms of your." I say, but the same thing. You're asking me to assuage that which you admire most about me, right? That's a paradox, right? So either you love that trait about me or you don't, right? So is there a way? I mean, just how I asked you earlier, how do we train people to use satire? Is there a way to teach academics to be more self-confident outside of their very narrow areas? Or is this something so inherent to your personality that it's not something that can be taught? You either walk with that larger than life thing or you don't.
I mean, I don't know. My gut, I don't really know. My gut is it's a little bit of both. Yeah. I mean, some people, their personality styles are predisposed to one or the other. But I also think that if someone decides that it's important to put themselves up there, that they can learn the skills needed to do that. So, I mean, some of the prominent science reform types, which are not on the political side, were for a long time kind of shy and withdrawn,
right,
and have put themselves out there successfully.
Well, which I guess speaks to the point. I mean, you're someone who's very active on social media. I'm someone who's very active on social media, but we're certainly a small minority amongst, the larger population of academics.
Absolutely.
What are the ways by which... Sorry?
Yes. No, I just agree.
So what are the ways by which we can convince certainly professors, but more generally the reward mechanisms at institutions that it is very valuable? I mean, I'm not talking about using social media so I can tell you about my favorite Thai cuisine, but to engage people, to share ideas, to fight against bad ideas. I mean, and again, I want to apologize to my viewers who've already heard me mention the story before, but I'll mention it again because it's worth repeating. I was giving a talk at Stanford Business School a few years ago, and one of my hosts took me out to dinner the night before. I think it was the night before, and he was of the opinion that appearing on Joe Rogan and doing all this stuff, that's not what we do at Stanford, right? To which I said, really? You think it's beneath you to appear on a show that's going to have 20 million downloads? I mean, it doesn't take a fancy mimeticist to understand that having a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal where only 4 people are going to read it is a lot less impactful than, do you know how many people have written to me and said they decided to study consumer psychology or evolutionary psychology because they saw me on Joe Rogan? How do we get them to flip that highfalutin, elitist ivory tower bent that many academics have?
I don't know that. I mean, look, there's I don't want to I don't want to overreach. I know Rutgers best because I've been here a long time.
Sure.
And Rutgers actually values that public engagement.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So, they're not going to value an appearance on Joe Rogan more than a paper in science,
right?
But they do. I mean, a year and a half ago, I got promoted to distinguished professor, which is kind of the highest thing they give, short of being a name chair.
Right.
And one of the criteria there is national and international impact. It's not just, and so they are looking for very conventional things like keynote talks and major papers and big grants. And they're totally looking for those things. But they're also looking for, things like op-eds and the sort of public presence that can manifest in lots of ways.
Right. That's good.
Yeah, it is good. So, but like kind of half of your question, to me, speaks to the dysfunctional ways in which the elite faculty at the elite universities kind of have the norms and incentive systems that drive much of academia locked up.
Right. Well,
and that's a problem.
Now, I think, and not to engage in, I mean, this is speculative, but let's go for it. I think that one of the reasons why the academics in question take those positions is it's an ego defensive strategy, right? I have mastered the communication process of publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and I've reached the pinnacle of my academic career doing this. Don't ask me to try something else. I don't feel comfortable getting on Joe Rogan. Right. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to denigrate you for being able to publish in peer-reviewed journals and appear on Joe Rogan, because they think that it's a mutually exclusive thing. I'm not saying either publish in Psych Review or appear on Joe Rogan. How about publish in Psych Review and appear on Joe Rogan?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So to me, there's a couple of intrinsic intellectual benefits, independent of the whole power structure, right? That one way around the groupthink of academia, especially on politicized issues, is to go directly to the people. And now you have a marketplace of ideas once again that is not okay, it's like, I'll debate with some intersectional feminist if they want. I mean, they're probably right. I mean, debate is like white supremacy. So I'm not sure that
intersexual, or did you say intersexual or intersectional?
Sectional. No, not sexual. It's sectional.
All right.
Some critical theorist, postmodernist. Right. I mean, I'm happy to have that discussion, but the discussion is not likely to happen because it's all arguing for anything from sort of the value of empirical science to the value of sort of civil discourse is now, thinly veiled white supremacy.
Right.
So it's not likely to happen, but I'm happy to, completely happy to do that. So, but the great thing about going around all that is you now have a truly politically and intellectually diverse audience who is much closer to a free and open marketplace of ideas than is academia.
Right.
That's one. And then the second, there's a lot of those people. I mean, you do business stuff and consumer stuff, right? Once you get outside academia, there are a ton of people who are really, really smart, really thoughtful, and think about things in ways very different than do most academics. And so that's great to be exposed to that. I love that. Totally love that.
And let me build on that. If I give a talk in front of high-powered business executives about my evolutionary approaches to studying business, they're all like, yeah, fantastic. I give the same talk to ideologically motivated people who wrongly believe that what I'm saying challenges or threatens their dogma, then they're like, I'm a Nazi. So the exact same message, either when listened to by people who are in the practice of doing this, they say, of course, I want to know how evolutionary psychology can be used in advertising to develop more effective messages. Who wouldn't want that?
I know, right. That's right. That is exactly right.
So let me ask you this. What are some of the, we're coming close to the end. It went by too fast. What are some of the things that you're now working on, other than this fantastic lexicon that you're working on, that's keeping you excited, that you might want to use this platform to promote?
Well, so Look, I mean, I'm a very conventional scholar. I'm publishing papers and all that kind of stuff. I have a fair number of very conventional research projects. I mean, we just got accepted. This paper is available on my Rutgers website. A conventional peer-reviewed scholarly paper that presents that would be accessible to like the reasonably intelligent lay audience. A model of how political biases manifest in academia.
Nice. Where was this published?
It's in press. It's not out yet, and it's actually part of. It's kind of a special issue. Okay. So, Corey Clark and Bo Weingard, who you might have run across, they're social psychologists, have published what was originally viewed as a target article in Psychological Inquiry. So this is a journal where the typical format is article and critique and commentary. But we were not alone. We used their article not so much to comment or critique their article, but as a jumping off point. Right? I mean, their article was on political biases in general. There was a small part on how they manifest in academia. We said, okay, we're going to put the academia stuff on steroids. So that was our paper. But then there are a whole slew of other papers that are, many of which push back and are critical of their view or, disagree strongly, but are kind of like good standalones. So the whole issue, this forthcoming issue of Psych Inquiry, should actually be a very good one.
Oh,
so that's the one. And the two, at the moment, I mean, and then I have all these empirical stuff. So one of my graduate students is taking the lead on a project trying to understand the sources of all the anti-Trump protests on the left. So once Trump got elected, there were immediately, all these major protests. And as a psychologist, then when you're just hanging around, it's obvious why. Well, people hate Trump and but that's, what does that mean really? What psychologically, I mean, when you go out and protest, you're spending time, effort, possibly money. It's not like just everybody who hates Trump goes out and protests.
Right.
And so, I could come up with hypotheses. I mean, we have a whole bunch of hypotheses, but, is it policies? Is it fear of racism? Is it just any Republican? I mean, it's just, is it that many of them consider him a personally despicable character? It's not really obvious what those are. So that we're working on that.
So that paper is looking at the motives of the Trump.
Yeah, that's right. And then I am after the banning at Psych Today, even though I'm appealing it, I do have an expanded version of the Orwell lexicon submitted to a dissident outlet, and they're evaluating it now. So
very nice.
I'm cautiously optimistic that it will see the light of day in a fairly prominent place, but not a done deal yet either.
Oh, very nice. Any books that you're working on?
I'm working on an edited book on straight up science reform. So it's all statistics and methods and practices and peer review. And that's almost done, actually. There's a bunch of really good stuff in there. We barely nick the political stuff, but that's not really the purpose of the book.
Here's one. As we're about to close, but as you're saying about the edited book and the lexicon, I don't know how you could maybe include what I'm about to say in either of those. So this is when someone proposes as a hypothesis an interaction above two-way, then they're a bullshitter. Okay?
Yes. Yes. So funny. This is a true story. About 4 or 5 years ago, we were interviewing for a social job, and we had 3 or 4 interviewees, and one of them claims in the job talk found this 3-way interaction, claimed to have predicted it. Right? And I'm like, bullshit detectors go way up, right? So I say, okay, I say basically what you just said, that it is very rare in my experience and opinion for someone to actually be able to predict a 3-way interaction. But you could overcome my skepticism by telling me that the predictions were pre-registered.
I was just going to say that. Register it, and then let's talk.
Yeah, then it's like, okay, you actually did predict your theory. You generated the prediction that was confirmed. Assuming no funny business in the methods and stats, I can believe that.
Right.
So she had not done that, and that was the end of her candidacy. She was just not considered after that.
And now she's working at Stanford Business School.
Well, God knows, I have no idea what ultimately happened to her. That may well be true.
Right.
So.
Hey, Lee, it's such a pleasure talking to you. Stay on the line so I can say goodbye to you offline.
Yeah.
And I look forward to following your stuff on Twitter. You're doing the Lord's work. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
Cheers.
Goodbye.